All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we are looking at slide 12, cell transport. So cell transport, again, is just this idea that stuff comes into and out of the cell. In order for things to get into and out of the cell, they have to cross the cell membrane. Whenever we talk about cell transport, ultimately, we are talking about things moving across the cell membrane. There are two basic types of cell transport. The first, which is in box 1 here, is what we refer to as passive transport. And passive transport, going down to box 2, does not require energy. So the question becomes, why doesn't it require energy, right? The reason why it doesn't require energy is because it is driven by diffusion. Diffusion is a natural state by which things flow from one area to another. If you've ever made Kool-Aid, you've seen diffusion, right? You pour the packet in, and then that one little center is really, really super red or orange or purple or whatever. But then it dissolves and it starts spreading out, and then it spreads out everywhere. So it has diffused. Now, if we have diffusion across the cell membrane, then we have cell transport. Now, how does diffusion work? Diffusion always works along the concentration gradient. I'm down in box number 3. So the concentration gradient naturally always will flow from high to low. If you are flowing from high to low, it never requires energy. I always say to people, like, imagine like it was like water at the top of a hill. If you dumped let's pretend like, I don't know, like you had like a slip and slide or a tube. If I poured water down a tube at the top of a hill, I would not have to add any energy to make it go down to the bottom of the hill. It would just naturally go from high to low. So again, passive transport is a form of cell transport, a way of getting things in and out of the cell that does not require energy because it follows the concentration gradient, which means it goes from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and that happens naturally. Now, there are 3 types of passive transport. The first is listed right here. Passive transport can be simple diffusion. Simple diffusion is one in which does not, I'm going to grab my little circle and I'm going to put it over the does not. It does not require proteins, okay? Simple diffusion, it pretty much just is stuff moving across the cell membrane. It's not a big deal. So what goes through simple diffusion? Oxygen, for example, carbon dioxide, for example. These are 2 gases that will just move easily across the cell membrane. Passive transport will also, again, does not require energy. It also includes something that we call facilitated diffusion. And facilitated diffusion is still diffusion. It still is passive transport. It still does not require energy, but it's facilitated. And the word facilitated means helped along, right? So what helps it along? A protein. And literally, it is what we call a channel protein. It is like a tube. It is literally a protein which creates like a tunnel across the cell membranes, and it allows polar substances. Remember polar substances where they have a slight charge on either side to move through. Now, what is this osmosis stuff? So again, passive transport does not require energy. We have simple diffusion, doesn't require a protein. We have facilitated diffusion. It requires a protein to help the stuff move through. And then we have this thing called osmosis. So what is osmosis? Osmosis is just diffusion, but it's diffusion of just plain old ordinary water, okay? If it's plain old ordinary water moving across the cell membrane, then we have osmosis. All right, so real quick recap. Cell transport is the ability to move things into and out of a cell across a cell membrane. The first one that we have looked at is passive transport. Passive transport does not require energy because it's driven by diffusion and the concentration gradient. The concentration gradient is the natural tendency that things have to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Passive transport can be divided into 3 types, okay? So passive transport includes simple diffusion. Simple diffusion is when you have stuff literally just moving across the cell membrane and it does not require anything. It just moves right across the cell membrane. We have facilitated diffusion, which is when we require a protein to help move those substances. Specifically, we use facilitated diffusion when polar molecule or substances need to get in. They're very hard to move across the cell membrane. So we have facilitated diffusion. So you have create a protein tunnel or protein channel, and those polar molecules travel through the protein. And again, it's still passive transport, so no energy is required. And finally, we have osmosis, still passive transport, which is literally just water moving across the membrane of the cell. Any questions on passive transport? Seeing none of the chat and hearing nobody unmute, we are going to continue. All right, the other form of cell transport is what we call active transport. Now, active transport, the definition is right over here. It does require energy because it transports very large molecule, or it moves molecules against the concentration gradient, okay? So if I am moving against the concentration gradient, if I am moving very, very large molecules, then I need to have active transport. And what makes active transport different than passive transport is that active transport requires energy. There are 3 types of active transport. There is exocytosis, box number 9. There is endocytosis. And I want you guys to take a look at that. Exo, endo, those are prefixes. We already know that cytosis or cyto means referring to the cell. So exo, what do you think is happening? What does the prefix exo perhaps mean? What does it sound like? Nobody? Okay.
Like it's not something.
Like it's what?
You said exo, right?
Exo, yeah. What do you think exo means?
Like it's out or something. It's
Yeah,
like
exo, like exit. It's leaving. So exocytosis means it's stuff leaving the cell. Endocytosis, what do you think that is? Endo.
in.
Into, yep. Exo, prefix that means out. Endo is a prefix that means in. Exocytosis, out of the cell. Endocytosis, into the cell. They both basically work the same way. If it is exocytosis, what the cell does is it creates a little bubble around the thing that it wants to get rid of, and it literally kind of like spits it out. The cell literally will create a little bubble around whatever it's trying to get rid of, and it will spit it out of the cell through the cell membrane. In endocytosis, if you've ever watched any kind of like sci-fi with like a blob creature, you know, the blob will always like kind of like surround the person or whatever and sort of like swallow them up. That's exactly how endocytosis works. If there's something outside of the cell that the cell needs to bring in, the cell will surround it and then pull it in. There is a video in your notebook that goes through this very, very well. It's one of the Amoeba Sister videos. All right, the other form of active transport, and again, active transport requires energy. The other form of active transport is what we call a sodium, potassium pump. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the one time in biology that they did not try to be cute. What do you think a sodium potassium pump pumps?
Sodium, potassium.
Sodium and potassium. There you go. Like a water pump pumps water, a sodium potassium pump pumps sodium and potassium. So the sodium potassium pump will pump 3 sodiums out and bring 2 potassiums in. If you've ever used a hand pump, you know how like you push down and you pull up and you so it's like you push and push and push and there's always like an in out kind of motion. Well, when those 3 sodiums go out, then 2 potassiums come into the cell and then 3 sodiums go out and 2 potassiums come in. And that is done to help maintain homeostasis. But here's the thing. It is a going against the concentration gradient. So that sodium is always in higher concentrations outside of the cell. So to keep putting sodium out, we are going against the concentration gradient, which means that we require energy to do this. That's kind of like if you wanted to get water to go uphill, you could totally do it, but you're going to have a pump and it requires energy. Any questions on active transport? All right, I am sliding down to slide 16, and I am going to the lower right-hand corner because to me, everything else you can find in the thing, but I definitely want to make sure that we talk about numbers 1 and 2 here in the corner. So why do we care about active transport? Why do we care about passive transport? Why are we even talking about this stuff? The thing is, the cell membrane creates a barrier. Okay, why is that important? Without the barrier, literally anything can get in, literally anything can get out. And therefore, that whether it's a single organism, single cell organism, or it is a multicellular organism, it doesn't matter. If that's happening, if there's no barriers, then you can't maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is one of the linchpins of all living things. All living things have to be able to control what comes in and what goes out. And when you control what comes in and what comes out, you can control your internal physical and chemical makeup. Once you can do that, you can maintain your life processes. That is the idea of maintaining homeostasis at the cellular level. Now, don't get me wrong. We as human beings, we still do this, right? Even though we're not a single cell organism. But instead, we have specialized cells, right? So I have like heart cells, and those heart cells make heart tissue, and my heart tissues make my heart, and my heart, along with some other organs, make my circulatory system, and the circulatory system helps me maintain homeostasis. Kind of like I might have lung tissue, and lung tissue makes, I'm sorry, I have lung cells, and lung cells make lung tissue, and lung tissue makes lungs, and lungs, along with some other organs, make my respiratory system that helps to maintain homeostasis. So whether it is happening at the single cell level or at the organism size level, either way, these barriers help to maintain homeostasis. Also, ladies and gentlemen, number 2, this cell membrane determines what substances are allowed to pass in what is known as selective, which I can't spell today, selective permeability. So what does that mean? That means not everything's allowed in and not everything's allowed out. Think about it. You breathe, when you breathe in all this mess of air, your body just keeps the oxygen and pushes out the nitrogen, the carbon dioxide, and everything else. It only lets the oxygen in. It doesn't let the other stuff in. It is selectively permeable. Again, why does this matter? This matters because all living organisms, whether it is single cell or multicell, must maintain homeostasis. If you cannot maintain homeostasis, literally, you died. So, how does this come into function? What's an actual application of this cell membrane being selectively permeable? Why does it even matter? I want you to think of a bacteria. Bacteria gets into your body and makes you sick. Every single one of us at one point or another in our lifetime have probably taken antibiotics, whether you took the pink liquid stuff when you were a little kid, or maybe you swallowed the amoxicillin pills. It doesn't matter. It's still an antibiotic. How do antibiotics actually work? Oh, well, they kill the bacteria. But how? What antibiotics actually do is they punch holes in bacterial cell membranes. That's literally what they do. So they will punch a hole through the membrane, and it no longer has a physical barrier. It will punch a hole through the membrane, and it is no longer selectively permeable. And because of that, it can no longer maintain homeostasis, and the bacteria die. Now, obviously, this happens over the course of 5, 10 days, whatever it is that you're taking the antibiotics, and eventually you kill off all of them. But that is an example of what happens when your homeostasis is not maintained. You die. Now, in this case, that's a good thing because the bacteria was making you sick. But if it happens on another level, these are things that could be very dangerous to any and all living things. Okay, 1 second. Let me stop